Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
It's Dr. Mike Patterson, your host of the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about what it takes to be a great leader and how to build a great team. I'm really pleased that you're listening today because we're going to address a topic that can be confusing: the world of psychometric assessments. If you've been in the workplace for more than a few months, or you attended graduate school, or you have access to the internet, there's a good chance that you've been exposed to a psychometric assessment or perhaps several assessments. In other words, most of the people listening to this podcast have taken some of these assessments. You've heard about several more, and you may be a huge obsessed fan of one or two. There are so many assessments on the market. Most have some value, and some are extremely good and useful in many ways. Others, not so good. Still others, big waste of time. In this episode of the Mission First People Always podcast, we're going to seek to understand this wild, crazy world of assessments, explain what they are and what they can do for you, and examine some of the more popular ones, and maybe even try to help you understand which might be most beneficial for your team or situation. Our goal today is not to bash anyone's product or choices you may have made. What we're going to do is increase your understanding of this complex world using science, psychology, and years of practical experience doing leadership and team development in the workplace. We're going to try to explain the differences and help you focus your search and ultimate selection on the psychometric assessments that are worth the time and money for you and your team.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
My guest today is Ray Linder. You may recall that Ray was featured on episode 13, where we talked about inclusioning. I received so much positive feedback about this episode and its message that I wanted to have my friend Ray back on the show as soon as possible. So here he is. You might recall Ray's a master facilitator, consultant, and coach who has worked with a wide variety of organizations in both the public and private spaces, and I consider him an elite expert on at least two of the assessments. He's a master facilitator of at least two of these assessments, and he's knowledgeable about many. So I can think of no better person to be in conversation with on this topic. He's based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and he is always on the road leading training for someone. So Ray, welcome back to the Mission First People Always podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. It's really, really good to be back with you. Appreciate the invitation.
You know, did you get the same kind of good feedback about your last appearance on the show that I did?
You know, Mike, it was really interesting. Yes, in general, absolutely, I did. It was very gratifying, but I got some pointed criticism too, that I had to admit was actually true.
Okay. So people didn't like your appearance? What are you saying?
Oh, they like the appearance, but people who know me really well know that I have an unhealthy obsession with the business, the industry, the recording, the listening, and the playing of music. And those people pointed out that they were shocked I could actually have a conversation for 30 minutes without bringing up the subject of music or making a reference to some song or artist in some way. And in fact, one friend said he wasn't even sure, he couldn't even rely on that was actually me in the podcast, right? So it didn't talk about music at all.
So it was a Ray Linder impersonator potentially who was on the last episode.
Yeah, definitely. So I took some pains to fix this problem this time around by actually constructing a playlist around the topic of personality. And if I could just for a minute, in putting that together, I found that actually to be a productive endeavor, not just an expression of my obsession about music. because as I was selecting songs for it, what I found was the range of songs in terms of time. There's a 30s big band song in there. There's a 1950s R&B song in there. There's a 80s punk rock song in there. 90s hard rock. It spanned a wide range of years as well as genres. And what it tells me is that this topic of personality is pervasive and of great interest, because when things get into sort of the arts as expressions of humanity, and artists of a wide variety of styles and eras are still talking about this one singular topic of personality, it tells me that there's something really, really important that we as human beings want to pay attention to and probably should pay attention to.
So, Ray, I am now convinced that it's the real you. We will include a link to your playlist in the show notes today. And I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of people curious to know how personality shows up in the world of music. And I agree. This is a topic of interest for many people, and there's quite a bit of confusion out there. As I said in the opening, we've all been exposed to assessments at some point, or certainly most of us have. We've probably had pretty good experiences. They've been interesting to us. We've learned a little bit, but let's dig deeper today. I want to tap into your expertise and just maybe go basic here and invite you to talk a little bit about what is personality, what are psychometrics, how do the two work together? Let's just lay a foundation for our friends.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure.
So personality, let's start there. I've got a great personality, everyone tells me. Well, maybe not everyone. I'm joking. Everybody has a personality. What does that mean?
Yeah, and just starting there is a fascinating place, Mike, because in point of fact, personality in a way isn't really anything. We're talking about a person, and if I'm talking to you, I can physically see you. I can see, your arms, your legs, your bald head, right? But when we talk about personality, personality is actually a construct. It's a concept. It's an idea. It's hypothesis. A surgeon can't go into your body and find personality. I can't look at you and say, oh, there's personality part of your being, Mike. So this is where I think then we get in a lot of confusion, because we're actually talking about something that's actually not not an actual tangible thing. Now, when we talk about what this idea is, which I guess is your real question, so a fancy sort of a scaled down version of this, of a fancier definition might be: personality is a stable set of characteristics or tendencies that get expressed in terms of thoughts, feelings, and actions that have continuity over a period of time. And then we would say also these thoughts, feelings, and actions are not related to social pressures. They're related just to me, my expression of myself, and not necessarily related to social pressures of the moment or biological pressures of the moment. So just say maybe a simple definition is a set of observable traits or characteristics that have been continuous over a long period of time, maybe as a simple definition of personality.
So it's how we're wired, basically, is what it sounds like. It's our hard wiring. And where does this come from? And when do our wires get connected? In other words, when does personality form in us? If this is stable and it's going to stick with us for life, does it happen at birth? Does it happen when we're, hit our 21st birthday? When does personality become established?
This is the age-old dichotomy, right? Of is it nature or is it nurture? And of course, the answer is yes.
Okay.
It is nature in that. We come into the world hardwired for certain aspect of all these tendencies I'm talking about. And we can kind of know that because we can see through brain imaging and brain scans, or we actually can go inside and see how our brains function. That, there are specific ways and specific traits so that, we can see that show up differently in terms of people's brain scans. That said, we're also people who learn and we take cues from our environment. And to the degree that we come into the world differently, we will respond differently to sort of the environment around us. But those kind of expressions of incorporation of the environment ends up becoming parts of our personality too. So we can't say it's one or the other. It's always both.
So nature, nurture, yes. Let's talk about that when question. The nature part of that suggests it's part of who we are. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our parental heritage.
Mhm.
So is the nature part of it what evolves and grows? When can we start looking at people's personality and gain something valuable?
Well, any parent who's had more than one child would tell you that it was pretty obvious when they got the second child that child was very, very different from the first one, really, really early on. But something that's a little bit more repeatable or more observable in terms of what we call these stable sets of characteristics. We can start maybe talking about that around ages 8 or 9, when we start wanting to form our own identities independently of primarily our parents or whoever's raising us. We're trying to form that independent identity around 8 or 9. And of course, as we go, we continue to sort of become more independent. And such that probably by the time we arrive in early adulthood, pick whatever your number is, late teens, early 20s, when we first start going to college and entering the workforce, we might say that sort of the awareness of those innate parts of us are more clear and can be more accurately described through a set of adjectives or qualities that are observable by others, which of course then is the point of personality assessments, is to kind of codify those kind of adjectives or those ways in which we or others might describe ourselves by the time we reach our late teens or early 20s.
So by the time the managers who are listening to this episode, get people into the workplace, we're ready to use psychometrics to help us understand people. That seems to be what you're saying. So let's transition to what psychometrics are. What are their assessments? They help us measure things. I know that, but tell us more. To help us define those terms in a way that the manager, the leader who's listening can kind of wrap their brain around it and talk knowledgeably about using this term.
Yeah, so let me even go a question you didn't ask. That one question maybe before that. The brief answer is psychometrics is a scientific discipline. I'll come back and say more about what that discipline is, but let me answer the question of why do we even need science in this regard? And it really does relate to this whole dichotomy, this false dichotomy of nature versus nurture. In that, there's a very, very famous saying by a couple of psychologists, Cluckwall and Murray, that say that what they say is every person is like every person is like every other person. Every person is like some other persons, and every person is like no other persons. And I'll repeat that because it's really, really important in terms of what assessments are trying to assess. So they're saying everybody is like everybody else in some ways. Everybody is like some other people in some ways, and everybody is like nobody else in some ways. And the goal of psychological assessments is to find that middle ground. In other words, where are we like some other people? Knowing that where we're like all other people is not particularly discriminate. We're all the same, so why bother measuring that? And if all the billions and billions of people who have ever lived are all different from each other, then we don't even need assessments. It's silly. But those areas where we're like other people, that's where the scientific discipline comes up, measuring the similarities between the ways in which you and I are similar in some ways, Mike, but the ways in which you and I are different. What qualities do we share with other people, and what qualities that make you and I very, very different? So to the point of psychometrics, then, the science, it's about a couple of different things, measuring two things. First of all, it's concerned with determining whether a particular view of personality actually exists. That's number one. And then secondly, if this particular theory or construct about personality exists, how do we measure the qualities that we believe exist in this theory? And could I give a fun maybe example of what I mean by these ideas, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'll be helpful.
Yeah. So let me just say that, Mike, I'm really, really excited. I've developed this theory of personality because of my love and interest in music. I have noticed that I think human beings can be classified according to the personality qualities or observable traits of different musicians. In other words, I think maybe there's a Paul McCartney type personality that I observe a lot of people are a lot alike. There's a Bruno Mars personality that I believe exists, and a Billie Eilish type personality that I think exists, and maybe a Miles Davis and Prince type personalities. And that's my theory of personality. And so what I'm about to do now, Mike, is I'm going to create an assessment that I want to put on the market that shows which type of personality you have according to this model of all these personality types. Now, in terms of psychometrics, I've just sort of laid out the two aspects of psychometrics. One, my theory of the way that human beings are hardwired. I've decided they're hardwired like other musicians that I've noticed. And I'm going to develop an assessment that allows people to answer questions in such a way that they can figure out which one of these personality types they are like.
Okay. And I'm grateful you didn't mention an Ike Turner type of personality, because that probably wouldn't be so great for folks to have.
Right.
But are we labeling people here? I mean, I've talked to folks who said I don't want to be labeled, and that's certainly a reasonable sort of response. Are we labeling people, or maybe if we're labeling people, are we doing it for good cause, good reason?
Well, I would like to think a good assessment is labeling people for a reason, but I totally understand. And I'm, a practitioner for many years, as you noted. And I've heard that, kind of criticism all the time that I don't want to be labeled. And that goes back to that quote, a quote called a Murray quote, that every person is like no other person's. And people do want to feel that they are unique, and that a particular personality assessment isn't capturing all that they are. And you know what? I completely agree with that. There is no one personality assessment that captures all of what makes me me. So I respect and I totally appreciate that. Yet, on the other hand, I like to say, well, we label people all the time. So if we're going to label people all the time, we might as well have the right labels. In other words, when I'm interacting with people, I'm already thinking about adjectives and I'm assigning them labels. So-and-so is the shy person. Joe is a really, really talkative person. Mary, on the other hand, she's really, really super helpful. And I'm assigning labels and adjectives to the behavior I observe in you to give me what I believe is a shortcut way of interacting with you in a way that I think is going to be helpful. Now, of course, just merely calling you helpful, I'm using one adjective out of 100 different ones that I could use about you if I knew them all. And if I were to ask you, how would you describe you? You might say helpful, and the other 99 things that you would use to describe you. So these labels are at best just a rough estimate. But I understand the idea that people don't want to be pigeonholed by one expression of their behavior that might be noticed about you at a particular point in time.
Yeah, sometimes when people say that to me, I refer them to a metaphor, and I metaphors work always to some extent, but they fall short in other areas. But I sometimes push back and say, well, what if you walked into a clothing store and there was a big heap of clothing in the middle of the floor, and you needed, a new shirt or new pair of pants or something, and you had to, shuffle through all this big pile of garments in the middle of the floor to find what worked for you, to find the style that worked for you, the fit that worked for you. Wouldn't it be easier if the clothes had sizes and they were put in different areas of the store where you could more easily find them, and all the blue shirts were in one area and all the blue jeans were in another part of the store? And so is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I might put it in form of a record store, Mike, as back when those things actually existed, right? So
Of
I walk
course
into
you
my
would,
old
Ray.
Tower Records and I know, I'm looking for jazz today, or I'm looking for, a good pop song, or, whatever. And so those labels were very, very helpful in terms of my identifying what I was actually dealing with. Of course, I would not spend money on something that was completely unlabeled and just turn over my whatever, $10, $15 and take something home without knowing what is actually even on it. In other words, how can I actually engage this in a knowing and intentional way if I don't know what it's about?
So there's a lot of confusion about assessments. We have laid a good foundation here. That's what you've told us about personality and what psychometrics are, incredibly helpful as a foundation. But we still face the reality of all these different alphabet soup sort of uh, different assessments are coming at us, and sometimes somebody likes one, somebody else likes the other. How do Let's get into this conversation about which one do we choose, and maybe we start with common misunderstandings, or maybe the biggest misunderstanding about assessments. What should we know on that front?
Yeah. So so I'll use two different words, descriptive versus normative. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is how is this assessment meant to be used? It's measuring something and giving you a result. Unless I'm clear about how I want that result to be used, then it lends itself for me to use it in a way that it was never intended to be used. So when we talk about a descriptive assessment, what we're really talking about is something that describes the labels, right? What kind of personality are you, Mike? And we'll get into the broader issue probably in terms of what I mean by personality in terms of what I'm assessing. But the point being, I can get a description. You and I have delivered these things many times, and your clients listening, get something that says you are a whatever, and here's a bunch of adjectives or a narrative or whatever where I can identify, yes, that sounds like me. Now, a normative assessment has a different goal. A normative assessment is not only describing those qualities, but it's measuring in a qualitative way those qualities as compared to somebody else. So it's not just saying, Mike, I'll go back to like the personality assessment I'm developing. Hey, Mike, you are a Prince type personality, and I turn out to be a Usher type personality, and look at the differences between those. We're just really talking about our descriptive differences between us. But where it becomes normative, then there's certain qualities in your assessment that rank you as high in that assessment. And therefore, qualitatively, that's a good thing. I'm lower in that trait. And therefore, that qualitatively compared to you, that's less valuable. And therefore, it allows someone to start making choices between you and I based on the comparative value of certain personality qualities. Now, I bring this up because too often I've seen it happen so often that people will use a descriptive instrument in a normative way and assume that some personality trait, let's take extroversion. If you are an extroverted personality, which by the way, I know you're not, and if I'm an introverted personality, if that could be used normatively by making the decision that quality of extroversion would be really, really useful in jobs where you have to interact with lots of people, right? So let's put you in a sales job or some other job, whatever, that requires you to interact with a lot of people, because Ray is not as good as that, when in fact, that instrument is not measuring how good you are or how not good I am at those traits. It's just merely describing that your inner nature is described by this set of characteristics, and it's neither good nor bad, or, relatively good or bad compared to somebody else. And likewise, just because I'm the opposite of that or different than that, there's no value judgment placed on me. Again, I'm just going to repeat: descriptive instruments used to describe, normative instruments used to compare for a relative value that has its place, but you need to know what the assessment you're using is intended, how that assessment is intended to be used.
So if a leader comes to you and says, I want to use an assessment to develop my team or to develop my my team's leadership ability, that's a developmental type of assessment. Where would you take that conversation from there? I want to get into this aspect of our conversation that I presented at the outset. How do you choose? I mean, we're getting there in our as we describe the different aspects of assessments, but how does the frontline leader identify the best tool for the job?
Yeah. So of course I've gotten this question many, many times, and just the way that you presented it. Or an organization is doing some sort of leadership development program, and they want an assessment for that. And they'll often ask me, so which assessment should we use for our leadership development program? And my immediate first question is, well, what is it that you want developed? The question shouldn't start with the assessment. To me, the first question is, what outcome do you want? What specific outcomes are you looking for? So when you say develop, then what is it that you want developed? Do you want them developed in their emotional intelligence? Do you want them developed in their ability to lead and manage change? Do you want them developed in agility? Do you want them developed in terms of relating to other people? In other words, what are the specific markers that you are using to say, yes, we have developed our leaders in these particular ways? Once we have that question answered, what are the outcomes that you are looking for very specifically? Then we can then move to the tools that best measure those particular outcomes. In other words, it's not really one size fits all. I want to develop you, and here's an assessment. No, what is it that I want developed in my leaders? And then let's find the best tool that actually measures those qualities that you're looking to be developed.
So begin with the end in mind is relevant here, as well as it's relevant in almost all the work that we do. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to get out of this? Let's start with a needs assessment before we start going, offering solutions. I think that's a really important message for folks. So let's just offer some examples of different assessments that might be useful in different types of contexts. You named several, Ray, just now. So if I want to learn how to communicate and collaborate better with colleagues, I'm a leader who needs to give feedback to my team members. I need to give direction at times. I need to bring the best out in people on my team. Where should I go? Where should I look?
Yeah, that's a really, really great specific example, Mike. So if you and I were working together, and I had asked you my first question, what is it you're looking for? And your answer was, I want to improve communication. I want my leaders, part of leadership development is want them to communicate better with their staff. Which means, setting expectations very, very clearly, which means being able to give feedback, to be able to give coaching, also be able to have hard and difficult conversations, and then dealing with people's emotions, your emotions or other people's emotions. Those are specific outcomes. And the good news is that we can look at assessments that specifically help leaders develop in their ability to do those specific things. But let me zoom out and talk about kind of a really interesting framework, interesting theory that was developed by a university psychology, professor of psychology at Northwestern University, a gentleman by the name of William Ravel. And probably in papers that were co-published, but my understanding is this was kind of his unique contribution to some of the work that other people have been listed on. He's done very interesting, and it's just called ABCs. And it's actually ABCD and later revised to add an E for different categories of personality. And that goes back to when we talk about personality, what is it you want specifically measured? And let's find the right tool that specifically measures those things. So when we're talking about measuring personality, we can talk about these 5 things. The A is for affect, which deals with mood, which deals with emotions. In other words, if I want to deal with feelings, quote unquote, emotions and moods and so forth, there are tools that help us measure affect. Most importantly, emotional intelligence tools deal with that. The B is for behavior. Basically, what is it that people do? And so you're now talking about communication. That's a thing that people do. So we can look at different behavior-oriented assessments. The DISC is a really, really popular example of something that measures sort of observable surface behaviors and patterns of those behaviors that raise people's self-awareness in terms of things that might come natural to them, as well as things that they might have to learn and grow to develop because they're less natural to them. So A for affect, B for behavior. The C is cognition. How do we think? How do we process information? How do we learn? How do we focus what kind of information will we most focus on when it comes to making decisions or, qualitative and quantitative decisions on things? The idea of cognition. The Myers-Briggs is probably the most popular assessment that fits in the area of cognition. Just how do people process information? The D, desires or drives. The simple answer to that is, what do we want? What are our values? What drives us? What stimulates us? What energizes us? Where does energy naturally flow out of us in terms of desires? A tool that you and I have used for a long period of time, and sometimes working together with clients, is something called the Strength Deployment Inventory. Which to me is one of, if not the most popular assessment in terms of measuring the idea of motivations or drives and desires, measuring what we want. And then the last one, the E, environment. How might we make different behavior choices given the environment that we may find ourselves in? And this maybe points to the idea of agility. How easily could I maybe shift my behavior based on changes in my environment? So the ABCDE model, I'll review them again really, really quickly here for you. A, affect or mood. B, behavior, what things people do. C, cognition, how do people think? D, desire, what is it that people want? And environment, how do I can maybe shift or alter my behavior based on where I am? People should be thinking in terms of when we talk about outcomes, then the outcome you want to me fits into one of those 5 different buckets.
I know most of the assessments, all of the assessments, it's not cut anything away from anyone here, are valid and reliable, and that those that you mentioned are all good, valid and reliable assessments. But why is validity and reliability important when we look at assessments? And that's a statistical question in part, but where does the rubber meet the road for people in the real world who aren't in stats class at university? They trust that other people have done the math, but they want something that just really useful and resonates with people on their team. What kind of validity is that, Ray?
Yeah, so you raised the two most important issues kind of in psychometrics, or the two primary topics that psychometrics is concerned with, reliability and validity. And so let's not turn it into a stats class. We can put it in layman's terms. Reliability is about consistency of measurement, and validity is about the accuracy of measurement, right? And so reliability means that if I say something is a thing, if I test you again, are you that particular thing? We think about, my scale. If I step on my scale and it tells me that I weigh something, and I step on it again in 5 minutes and it gives me the same number, and if I wait another 5 minutes, it gives me the same number, then I can say, well, it's measuring my weight consistently. But I would call it, and the point being, but if I step on it right now and it gives me a number, and I step on it again in 30 seconds and it gives me a number that's very, very different than the number I got before, then I have to be concerned with, well, okay, how do I know which one of these is actually true if it's not going to measure me consistently, right? Validity is the issue of accuracy. Is it real? Is this result true or not? And part of that is involved is this actually measuring the thing that I say it's measuring? Because if it's not, then I can't really trust the accuracy of that. Again, we'll use my scale thing here. I have this theory, Mike, that based on what you weigh, I can guess what your speed will be in the 100-yard dash. Now, you're probably already questioning me, well, that can't be right. And of course, that's a ridiculous kind of a statement. My scale cannot give me information on on what my 100-yard dash time is. Therefore, I would say that this is an invalid instrument to measure my speed in the 100-yard dash, because those things are completely unrelated to each other, and it's not measuring what it's supposed to measure. And therefore I need to throw that assessment out if that's what I'm trying to measure. So does it measure something consistently if that's what it's supposed to do? And does it measure something accurately? Those are two concerns that people should be giving some thought to. The best assessments on the market have done the kinds of testing that make sure that if personality is stable, then the things that I'm measuring can be measured consistently over time, and then it also measures those things accurately.
What's the idea of face validity? I think I have a basic understanding of that term, and I think it's a useful term for us to understand together here. What does that mean, face validity?
Yeah, so there's 4 different kinds. Depending on who you talk to with statisticians, you talk to, there's a bunch of different fancy names. You can talk about 4 types of validity, or 7 types of validity, or 5 types of validity, and so forth. Face validity is often the very first thing that is considered, and in a way, the most important, but from a scientific standpoint, the least important. So I'm glad you actually raised that particular question, but let me answer the question let's answer it first, and I can talk about the 2 caveats I put around it. Face validity is just simply, on its face, when I look at my result, does that sound like me? Is that reasonable? So if I take an MBTI, or I take the SDI, or I take the DISC, and I get my high D, or, INTP, or red green in whatever assessment, and I read a description of that, the first question I'm immediately answering for myself is, on its face, does that sound like me? Now, in one regard, that is a very, very hugely important thing. Clearly, we don't want to give out personality assessments that people look at and go, well, what is this? This doesn't describe me at all, right? That wouldn't be particularly helpful. So we do want to have an assessment that would say that does describe people in ways that people would agree with. But the challenge with that is something called the Barnum effect. So let me talk about the Barnum effect here. So a known sort of psychological bias that we as human beings have. And so the Barnum effect is this phenomenon that happens when people believe that personality descriptions that they get from any of the instruments I talked about, or others that I haven't measured. So it's a phenomenon that happens when I get an assessment result that has a description that I believe that it specifically applies to me and only me, or other people like me, when in fact, there are many elements of that description that could actually apply to everybody. And therefore, I am not really measuring elements of my personality accurately, because the personality assessment is designed to tell me who I am like, and also tell me who I am not like. And if it can't do that, then it's not really an accurate assessment. Go back again to this Barnum effect, which says that when I hand you a personality assessment, you believe that this is actually telling you information that is true about people like you, when in fact it also has information that says that is true about people who are not like you. And that's that's one of the tricky parts about face validity. I agree, but I have a bias to want to agree with something that might not actually be true.
Ray, our time's drawing to a close here. Let's make this real and practical for the frontline leaders who are listening to the show today. What do you want people in the real world to know about assessments, and why should we find the right one for our teams?
Question number one, I tell everybody when I mentioned it before, question number one, what is the outcome that you are looking for that leads you to believe that a or any personality assessment will produce an outcome? What are the things I am looking for, or again, what is the outcome that I want, and be very, very specific about it. And then I can turn my attention to then what assessments are there out there that will measure these attributes that are going to accomplish the outcome I'm looking for. You raised one. I want people to have better relationships so that they can be developed in their people skills and improve their communication and get better coaching, feedback, and so forth. Okay. Now we're talking about, like I said, behavior. We're talking about maybe dealing with also people's emotions. So, we can look at tools that play in those particular spaces. I think it's also really, really important that people do consider what assessments, what is the theoretical basis behind an assessment, and where is the data that supports that particular theory? Kind of playfully threw out to you my great idea that there are different personality types out there that can be described by the personalities of different musicians. Okay, Ray, that's great. But where do you have data that supports that actually might be a thing, or that actually might be true? People need to ask hard questions about the science behind the assessments that they're using. But in the real world, also, we've got to consider trade-offs of cost and time. All assessments don't cost the same. All of them require different amounts of time to have people to understand their assessment results. Some people can take it online, get a result or a printout right away, read it in 2 minutes. It makes some sense to them. That's great. Other assessments require maybe a whole day of a qualified and certified facilitator to take people through the implications of their results. Obviously, that's a greater expense of time and a greater expense of money. And so just to be aware that you do get what you pay for when you are dealing with some of the financial costs and the time spent learning and applying. And there's no one size fits all in that type of regard. So what are the measurable outcomes I'm looking for? What is my trade-offs in terms of time and expense on them? And then finally get to, okay, so given these constraints, what assessments will best meet the criteria that I'm kind of placing in terms of outcomes and resource necessary to get those outcomes?
All right, Ray, last question, and I'm going to put you on the spot. And you won't be surprised that I am putting you on the spot. What is your, and you've been a great guest. Your knowledge, just the depth of your knowledge just blows me away. And yes, you know about music and wine, and you know about a lot of stuff, but you are a real deep thinker in this world of assessments. And I'm grateful that I've been able to learn from you. But the moment of truth here, what is your go-to assessment?
Yeah, so I don't have a problem saying that my go-to assessment is a strength deployment inventory. And it comes through all of the criteria, the filters that I kind of place on that. But I've always felt like, and I love all the other assessments I use too, but I've also always felt that I can have the greatest impact on your behavior or your willingness and give you a roadmap to changing your behavior in productive ways. The greatest impact on you in the shortest amount of time with that particular assessment. And one of the reasons I think that is true is that assessment is actually a system of assessment. So you take it all at once. So people think they're taking one assessment, but there's actually 4 different components to it. And if I go back to my ABCDE model, the beauty of the SCI is it plays in multiple frameworks. So it does because it deals with how I change when things are going, how I show up in my interactions when things are going well with other people, and how I might look differently when I'm in conflict now being an emotional response. Now I'm playing in the A part of the model, affect. There's another part of the assessment that deals with specific behavior choices. And that, so that plays in the B part of the model. At its core, at its root, is measuring core motives. So we're talking about the desire, the D part of the model. The behaviors that play in the B are designed, the assessment is designed to think about behaviors in a particular context. Given a specific context, i.e. my role at work, what are the behavior choices that I tend to make to produce successful outcomes in this particular environment? So it also plays in the E part of the model. The one area where it doesn't play a role in, I would say, is the cognitive part of the model, just kind of how we think about things and process information and so forth. But it does touch somewhat in 4 others of those areas. And in a couple of those areas, it touches very, very deeply. So it is my go-to. I do like using in conjunction with others. I do like using in conjunction with a cognitive model. So I sort of have all 5 of those bases kind of covered. But it's my go-to. Like I said, I can accomplish more in the shortest amount of time with this strength deployment inventory.
Well, Ray, we can agree on that. The strength deployment inventory, the learning tool that powers core strengths training, has been my assessment of choice for about 20 years. I have used it with literally hundreds of groups, led training for thousands as you have using this tool. And very sincerely, I've never had someone walk away from one of those sessions and say that this time was not valuable to me. In fact, I think that's what the real incredible value of the SDI is. People not only have an immediate positive response to the insight they've gained about themselves and others, but they see it as immediately useful. It's memorable. They can put it to work right away. And as a result, it's sustainable and has good value. So, Ray Linder, you are tremendously knowledgeable about this topic, and you are definitely someone from whom we can all learn. Here are some of my big takeaways from this episode. A psychometric assessment is simply a tool. It's a learning tool that helps us understand people and their personalities. There are a variety of them, and they all do something a bit different. And just like any other tool, we should choose that tool based on what we're trying to accomplish. I think the problem for many of us is that we don't begin with the end in mind. In other words, we don't ask the question, what are we trying to accomplish here before we choose the tool, before we gravitate towards one that a friend recommended or had a good experience with, or we go with the least expensive option, or we go with one that our company has used in the past. We should be thinking about what the assessment does and what we're trying to accomplish. What Ray and I do both agree on is that our go-to assessment of choice is the SDI 2.0, and it's our go-to because it gives us something called relationship intelligence. And relationship intelligence is insight that we can use to adjust our approach when working with different kinds of people in order to get better outcomes. It helps us understand ourselves and work better with others. And it's the assessment I found to be most effective. It's comprehensive because it looks at motives and strengths. It looks at when things are going well, that condition, and when we face the inevitable conflict. It's memorable because it's color-coded. It's easy to apply those insights right away, and it comes with some incredible technology to provide relationship intelligence at just the right time. So here's the bottom line. Psychometric assessments are extremely valuable, but they are a means to an end, not the end itself. We use them to get better results with people, so we need to choose the assessment that best helps us achieve that end, better results with, through, and for people. Thanks for listening. Please follow, subscribe, and share. Tell a friend or colleague about what we're doing here on the Mission First, People Always podcast. They'll be glad you did. Until next time, work to bring out the best in someone around you, because that's what great leaders do.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.